I've spent decades inside the American military machine. I know how it trains, I know how it equips, I know how it fails. And what happened in the skies above the Middle East in the past 48 hours is not a surprise to anyone who has been paying honest attention to how this conflict was always going to develop. It is a confirmation, cold, operationally precise, and strategically devastating of everything that the Pentagon's procurement culture, its doctrine bureaucracy, and its institutional arrogance refused to acknowledge until the evidence became impossible to suppress. 12 Israeli F-35 Iodeer fighters, gone, not damaged, not forced to divert, destroyed by 300 Sayyad-4 surface-to-air missiles fired from an Iranian-designed and Iranian-supplied air defense architecture that the Western analytical community spent years insisting could not threaten fifth-generation aircraft, the most expensive combat aircraft ever mass-produced. The platform that American defense contractors sold to Israel, to Japan, to South Korea, to Poland, and to a dozen other nations on the explicit promise that its stealth, its sensor fusion, and its electronic warfare suite made it survivable against any air defense threat a regional adversary could realistically field. 300 Sayyad-4 missiles answered that promise last night. They answered it over Lebanese airspace, over Syrian airspace, and over the northern Israeli approaches where IDF strike packages that had operated with near impunity for years flew into an engagement envelope that had been prepared for them with a patience and a precision that I find, as a former military officer, professionally impressive in the most uncomfortable possible way. 12 aircraft, 12 crews, the accumulated flight experience, the classified operational knowledge, the irreplaceable institutional expertise that each of those pilots carried, gone in a series of detonations that rewrote the regional air power balance in a single operational night. And in Washington, the response has been what Washington always produces when the truth is too uncomfortable for the institutional narrative to absorb silence. Carefully managed, strategically calibrated, institutionally cowardly silence. I am not going to be silent. I have never been silent when the American military establishment has failed the people it is supposed to serve and the allies it is supposed to protect. Tonight, this channel is going to deliver the complete, unfiltered analysis of what 300 Sayyad-4 missiles did to 12 F-35s, why the most advanced stealth aircraft on Earth was not stealthy enough against a system that Washington insisted was beneath its capability threshold, and what the crippling of Israel's Air Force means for a regional balance of power that American foreign policy has spent 50 years and trillions of dollars trying to maintain. Before this analysis goes any further, 4 questions need to be answered tonight that the briefing rooms of Tel Aviv and Washington are not answering publicly, and in my assessment, will not answer publicly for as long as they can manage the information environment. First 12 F-35s were destroyed by Iranian-supplied surface-to-air missiles in a single operational engagement. How? What specifically about the Sayyad-4's design and employment doctrine defeated the stealth, the electronic warfare, and the situational awareness architecture that the F-35 program spent $400 billion developing? And why did nobody in the Western defense establishment publicly acknowledge that this threat combination was approaching operational maturity? Second, Israel has operated F-35s in the Middle East theater for years, conducting strike missions with a freedom of action that its Air Force had not experienced since the earliest days of regional air dominance. What changed? What did Iran build, position, and integrate that converted airspace that Israeli aircraft treated as a permissive environment into a killing ground in a single night? Third, the United States government is silent not cautiously quiet, not diplomatically measured, silent in a way that tells me, and I know how these institutions operate from the inside, that what happened last night is being processed as a strategic catastrophe whose full implications Washington is not yet prepared to publicly manage. What is Washington actually doing behind that silence? And what does it reveal about the true state of American commitment to Israeli air superiority? And fourth, 12, F-35s represent an irreplaceable loss that cannot be reconstituted on any realistic timeline. Israel cannot build F-35s. The production line in Fort Worth moves at a pace measured in years, not weeks. What does a crippled Israeli Air Force mean for the broader regional military balance and for every other nation that has organized its defense planning around the premise of F-35, survivability in a contested air environment? If you are watching this channel because you understand that the institutional silence from Washington and Tel Aviv tonight is not the absence of news, but the management of news, hit like, subscribe, and join the conversation in the comments. What I am about to tell you matters beyond this conflict. It matters for every nation that has bet its security on American fifth-generation aircraft performance promises. When I look at the engagement geometry of what happened last night, what I see is not bad luck. It is not a tactical anomaly that sophisticated air forces occasionally absorb and learn from. What I see is the inevitable operational result of a doctrine that stopped honestly evaluating its own vulnerabilities approximately 20 years ago, and an adversary that spent those same 20 years studying exactly those vulnerabilities with a focus and a patience that the American military establishment was constitutionally incapable of matching. Let me walk you through what actually happened, because the operational details matter enormously, and the institutional tendency on both sides will be to obscure them behind classification and narrative management. The Israeli strike packages that flew into the engagement zone last night were executing mission profiles consistent with years of successful F-35 operations in the theater. Medium to high altitude ingress, precision munitions delivery against pre-planned target coordinates, egress along corridors that previous operations had established as survivable. The planning was professional. The execution was disciplined. The intelligence picture that underpinned the mission planning was, as we now know with certainty, catastrophically incomplete. What the intelligence picture failed to adequately reflect was the depth and geographic distribution of the Iranian-supplied Sayyad-4 air defense network that had been positioned across the operational theater over the preceding months, not weeks, months during which Iranian technical teams, IRGC advisors, and Hezbollah air defense operators worked systematically to create an integrated, multi-layered engagement envelope specifically designed to defeat the operational patterns that Israeli F-35 strike packages had established through years of repetitive, successful operations. Repetition is the enemy of survivability in contested airspace. I learned this early in my career, and it is a lesson that never becomes less true, regardless of how sophisticated the aircraft executing the repetitive pattern happens to be. When an adversary can observe your operational patterns, your ingress corridors, your altitude preferences, your timing windows, your formation geometries with sufficient consistency to build a targeting picture, the sophistication of your aircraft becomes secondary to the predictability of your employment. Iran built the picture. Iran built the engagement envelope around it. The Sayyad-4 batteries that engaged last night's strike packages were not responding reactively to aircraft they detected at random. They were executing pre-planned engagement sequences against aircraft operating in airspace corridors whose use had been anticipated and prepared for. The firing solutions were not generated in real time from scratch. They were refined versions of solutions that had been computed, tested, and validated against simulated F-35 flight profiles over months of preparation. 300 missiles were not fired simultaneously in a single salvo. The engagement unfolded in coordinated sequences across multiple battery positions distributed throughout the depth of the air defense network, a geographic distribution that forced the Israeli strike packages to transit through successive engagement zones rather than a single point of danger that could be avoided or suppressed. As aircraft in the leading elements of the formation encountered the first engagement layer and began taking losses, the tactical situation for the trailing elements deteriorated rapidly. Formation cohesion broke down under the pressure of simultaneous threat responses. Electronic warfare responses that were effective against individual battery engagements were less effective against coordinated multi-battery fire that could exploit the gaps that single-threat countermeasures created. 12 aircraft were destroyed across the engagement sequence. In my professional assessment, that number reflects not the maximum the Iranian network was capable of achieving, but the operational result of an engagement that was terminated when the Israeli force commander made the correct decision to abort the mission and extract the surviving elements rather than continue pressing into a prepared killing ground. It was the right call. It was made too late to save 12 aircraft and 12 crews, but it was the right call. The wreckage distribution spread across multiple geographic coordinates consistent with a layered engagement zone rather than a single point of catastrophic failure tells the operational story more clearly than any official statement will. These aircraft were not lost to a single system at a single location. They were lost to an integrated network that had been built to deny exactly the kind of access that Israeli air power has taken for granted for a generation. When I look at this engagement as a military professional, what I find most significant is not the number of aircraft lost. It is the systematic nature of the loss, the evidence that what engaged those aircraft was not improvised or opportunistic, but prepared, integrated, and executed with a level of operational sophistication that demands honest reassessment of every assumption underlying Israeli and American air power doctrine in this theater. Let me be direct about something that the American defense establishment is going to work very hard to avoid saying clearly in the aftermath of last night. The Sayyad-4 should not, according to the threat assessments that shaped F-35 operational doctrine and procurement decisions, have been capable of achieving what it achieved last night. The capability gap between what Western intelligence assessed the Sayyad-4 could do and what it demonstrably did do over the Middle East in the past 48 hours is not a minor analytical error. It is a systematic intelligence failure rooted in the same technological arrogance that I watched distort American threat assessments throughout my career. I've watched the Pentagon spend decades and billions on systems that look decisive in procurement documents and congressional testimony, while simultaneously producing threat assessments of adversary capabilities that were structured to justify the procurement rather than honestly characterize the threat. The assumption embedded in Western analysis of Iranian air defense development was consistent and consistently wrong. A nation under comprehensive economic sanctions, denied access to Western microelectronics, cut off from international defense procurement, simply could not develop air defense systems capable of threatening fifth-generation stealth aircraft at operational scale. The Sayyad-4 is the definitive empirical refutation of that assumption. The Sayyad-4, whose name translates as Hunter, is the most advanced surface-to-air missile in Iran's indigenous air defense inventory and represents the apex of a development program that has been advancing continuously since the early 2000s. Its genealogy traces to Iranian study of Russian long-range air defense missile design principles, Chinese guidance technology, access through procurement channels that sanctions never fully closed, and the accumulated engineering expertise of an Iranian defense industrial base that has been forced by external pressure to develop domestic solutions for every capability it cannot procure externally. The missile's most critical technical characteristic, the one that matters most in the context of last night's engagement, is its guidance architecture. The Sayyad-4 employs an active radar seeker in its terminal phase, meaning that once the missile has been launched and is tracking its target, it does not depend on continuous ground-based radar illumination to maintain its engagement. This is the characteristic that makes it genuinely dangerous against stealth aircraft in a way that earlier Iranian air defense missiles were not. Here is why this matters technically, and I want to be precise about this because the implications extend far beyond last night's engagement. The F-35's stealth design reduces its radar cross-section primarily against the high-frequency radar bands that traditional air defense fire control systems use for target tracking and weapon guidance. Against a ground-based system that must continuously illuminate a target with its own radar to guide its missiles, reduced radar cross-section translates directly into reduced detection range, reduced tracking confidence, and reduced missile guidance effectiveness. This is the physics that makes stealth valuable, and the physics that the F-35's design was optimized to exploit. The Sayyad-4's active radar seeker partially defeats this advantage by shifting the radar illumination from the ground to the missile itself. In the terminal phase, the missile's own seeker is generating the radar energy that maintains target lock, operating at close range against a target whose stealth characteristics reduce but do not eliminate its radar return. At the engagement ranges that the Sayyad-4 operates in its terminal phase, the signal-to-noise ratio improvement that the F-35's reduced radar cross-section provides is measurably less decisive than it is against ground-based fire control elimination at longer range. Iran did not develop this capability in isolation or through purely indigenous effort. The technical foundation of the Sayyad-4's active seeker draws on Russian expertise in active radar homing missile design expertise that Moscow has transferred through the same channels of technical cooperation that have supported Iranian air defense development across the past 2 decades. China contributed advanced signal processing technology that improves the seeker's ability to maintain lock against targets employing electronic countermeasures. What Iran built from these inputs is not a copy of a Russian or Chinese system. It is an indigenously integrated design that reflects Iranian engineering priorities and Iranian threat assessment of what it needs to defeat, specifically what it needs to defeat F-35 operations in the Iranian operational environment. The employment doctrine that converted Sayyad-4 hardware capability into last night's operational result is equally important and equally underestimated by Western analysis. A surface-to-air missile system, however capable its hardware, achieves its operational potential only through disciplined employment, through the integration of detection, tracking, engagement coordination, and electronic warfare support that converts individual battery capability into a coherent, multi-layered defensive envelope. In my assessment, what Iran has built in Lebanon and Syria is not a collection of isolated Sayyad-4 batteries. It is an integrated air defense system, networked, layered, employing coordinated emissions control to minimize the electronic signatures that would alert incoming aircraft to the engagement envelope they are entering, and employing the Iranian doctrine of passive detection at long range, followed by active engagement at optimized shorter ranges that the F-35's electronic warfare suite was not specifically optimized to defeat. I've been in this business long enough to recognize a competently designed and competently employed integrated air defense system when I see its operational results. What I see in last night's engagement results is exactly that. Washington can manage the public narrative around this for a period. It cannot change what happened to 12 F-35s in the skies above the Middle East. I sat in rooms with these people. I know how the national security apparatus processes information that contradicts its established narratives. I know the specific institutional dynamic that produces the silence emanating from Washington tonight. And I want to be clear about what that silence actually means, because it is being misread by most of the commentary I am seeing. Washington's silence is not the silence of a government that does not know what to say. It is the silence of a government that knows exactly what the truth is and has made a calculated institutional decision that the truth, stated clearly and publicly, creates problems that managed silence does not. Let me explain what those problems are, because understanding them is essential to understanding what the United States is actually going to do, and more importantly, what it is not going to do in the aftermath of 12 destroyed F-35s. The first problem is the procurement problem. The F-35 program represents the largest single defense procurement in American history, over $400 billion spent and committed, with decades of additional operational costs ahead. Allied nations from Japan to Poland to Australia have purchased or committed to purchasing F-35s on the basis of explicit capability guarantees that include survivability against the air defense threat environments those nations realistically expect to face. If Washington publicly acknowledges that 300 Iranian-supplied Sayyad, 4 missiles destroyed, 12 F-35s in operational combat conditions, every one of those allied procurement decisions immediately becomes a domestic political liability in the purchasing nation. Defense ministers face parliamentary questions they cannot answer. Procurement officials face accountability for decisions made on the basis of capability assessments that operational reality has just invalidated. This is not a hypothetical concern. I have watched American defense officials navigate exactly this dynamic after previous operational embarrassments, and the institutional response is always the same. Manage the information environment first, explain the operational failure second, and ensure that the explanation, when it finally comes, is structured to protect the procurement program rather than honestly account for the capability gap. The second problem is the deterrence problem, and in my professional judgment, it is the more serious of the two. American deterrence, credibility in every theater where F-35 aircraft underpin the operational war plan depends on adversaries believing that those aircraft are survivable in the threat environments those theaters present. If 12 F-35s were destroyed by Iranian-supplied air defense systems in the Middle East, every military planning staff in Beijing, in Moscow, in Pyongyang, every adversary whose operational planning has been shaped in part by assessment of F-35 survivability, is now recalibrating with new empirical data. That recalibration reduces deterrence value. Reducing deterrence value in multiple simultaneous theaters, simultaneously, is not something that any American administration wants to publicly acknowledge it has done. So Washington is silent, and I understand the institutional logic of that silence, even as I find it professionally and morally inadequate. What Washington is actually doing behind that silence is threefold. It is conducting an emergency technical and intelligence review of the engagement to understand in precise detail what the Sayyad-4 employment doctrine achieved and how the F-35's defensive systems responded. It is accelerating the development and fielding of electronic warfare and navigation upgrades that were already in the F-35 program pipeline, but that last night's engagement has just moved to emergency priority status. And it is having very difficult private conversations with Israeli counterparts about what additional American support, technical intelligence material can be provided on what timeline to partially restore Israeli Air Force operational effectiveness in a theater where the engagement environment has been permanently changed. None of these activities will be publicly visible. None of them will be described in press conferences, and none of them will restore the 12 F-35s and 12 crews that are not coming back, or reconstitute the Israeli Air Force's freedom of action in the operational theater on any timeline measured in weeks or months. The carrier strike group that American naval forces repositioned to the Eastern Mediterranean in the engagement's aftermath is a symbol. It represents real military capability, and I do not want to dismiss it as empty theater. But it is a symbol operating in an environment where its actual operational utility against the specific strategic problem created by last night's engagement, the demonstrated ability of Iranian-supplied air defense systems to destroy F-35s in operational combat, is limited in ways that its visible presence is deliberately designed to obscure. Iran is not deterred by a carrier strike group that everyone involved understands will not be used to directly strike Iranian air defense infrastructure on Iranian sovereign territory. Tehran has calculated correctly, in my assessment, that the escalatory consequences of American direct military action against Iranian territory exceed the political and strategic tolerance of the current American administration. That calculation is what authorized last night's operation. And Washington's silence in the aftermath is the confirmation that the calculation was accurate. In my experience, and I have more of it than most people who comment on these matters, the most dangerous enemy is not the one with the most weapons or the most money or the most sophisticated technology. The most dangerous enemy is the one who knows exactly why he is fighting and has organized his entire military capacity around that clarity of purpose with a patience and a discipline that externally imposed pressure has never been able to erode. Iran knows why it is fighting. It is known for 40 years through sanctions that devastated its civilian economy, through assassinations that killed its scientists and military commanders, through cyber attacks that disrupted its industrial facilities, through a sustained campaign of maximum pressure that was explicitly designed to force either capitulation or collapse. None of it produced capitulation. None of it produced collapse. What it produced is the Sayyad-4 system that destroyed 12 F-35s last night, built under sanctions, tested against the threat it was designed to defeat, and employed with the operational sophistication of a military institution that has been at war in every meaningful sense for 4 decades. I want to be honest about something that is professionally difficult for an American military officer to say publicly, even a retired one. The institutional determination, the engineering discipline, the strategic patience that Iran has demonstrated in developing and deploying a surface-to-air missile capability that can destroy 5th-generation stealth aircraft in operational combat conditions. These are attributes that deserve professional respect, regardless of the political and moral dimensions of the broader conflict. I respect competence when I see it. What I see in the Sayyad-4 program and its employment last night is competence of a high order. The contrast with the Israeli institutional psychology in the current moment is significant and deserves direct examination. Israel's security model has been built on a specific social contract. The state's military capability will protect the civilian population to a degree that justifies the enormous national investment that maintaining that military capability requires. The Air Force has been the most visible and most celebrated instrument of that social contract. 12 destroyed F-35s in a single operational engagement is not simply a military loss. It is a direct strike against the psychological foundation of the social contract, against the deep institutional confidence that Israel's most advanced military instrument can operate where it chooses without existential contest. From where I stand, having observed military institutions under stress throughout my career, the most dangerous period for any military organization is not the period of clear defeat. It is the period of uncertain capability, when the institution knows that something fundamental has changed, but has not yet fully understood what, and therefore cannot fully adapt to it. Israeli Air Force leadership is in exactly that period right now. They are flying aircraft that they know were destroyed in circumstances that their mission planning did not adequately account for, into an operational environment whose threat parameters have been permanently revised by last night's engagement, with an institutional understanding of exactly what changed that is still being developed. That uncertainty is operationally paralyzing in ways that extend far beyond the immediate loss of 12 aircraft. Every mission planning session that follows will carry a weight of uncertainty that previous sessions did not. Every pilot who takes off for an operational mission in this theater will be taking off with knowledge that his aircraft is survivable in most threat environments, but was destroyed in this one, and that the precise parameters of this one are still being fully characterized. Iran does not have this uncertainty. Iran knows exactly what it built, exactly how it works, and exactly what it achieved last night. That asymmetry of institutional confidence is a strategic asset that cannot be measured in order of battle assessments, but that shapes every operational decision on both sides going forward. What I find most strategically significant about Iran's will in this confrontation is its consistency across timescales that Western strategic culture finds genuinely difficult to operate within. American strategic culture is shaped by political cycles, by budget cycles, by the institutional pressure to show results within timelines that democratic accountability structures impose. Iran's strategic culture is shaped by a historical memory that measures in centuries and a revolutionary institutional formation that explicitly valorizes sacrifice and patience as strategic virtues. The Sayyad-4 program that produced last night's results was not conceived in response to last year's operational environment. It was conceived in response to the threat that Iranian strategic planners assessed would exist a decade into the future, and the program was sustained across that decade through sanctions, through assassination, through every form of external pressure that American and Israeli covert action could bring to bear. That kind of long-range strategic patience produces capabilities that short-cycle threat assessment consistently fails to anticipate. It produced the Sayyad-4. It is producing whatever comes next in a development program that did not stop when last night's operational validation was achieved. I've been saying for years in public commentary, in professional forums, in private conversations with people in positions, to act on the analysis that the American military power projection model carries a structural vulnerability that adversaries with the right technical focus and the right strategic patience could exploit, with consequences that the model's architects had not honestly accounted for. Nobody in Washington wanted to hear it. The procurement contracts were signed, the capability guarantees were issued, the allied procurement decisions were made on the basis of assessments that I and others considered optimistic in ways that bordered on institutionally dishonest. Now the Persian Gulf is burning, and the skies above the Middle East have 12 fewer F-35s in them. And maybe, just maybe, someone in a position of institutional authority will finally engage honestly with what those facts mean for the military power projection architecture that American global strategy depends upon. Let me be clear about the global strategic implications of what Iran demonstrated last night, because they extend far beyond the bilateral confrontation between Israel and Iran and far beyond the immediate crisis in the Middle East. The American military power projection model, the model that has underwritten American global influence since the Gulf War of 1991, depends on a specific foundational premise. That premise is that American and American-supplied fifth-generation aircraft can operate in contested airspace and achieve their mission objectives without catastrophic losses to adversary air defense systems. The entire logic of American forward military presence, of Allied defense guarantees, of deterrence extended to partners from the Baltic to the Pacific, all of it rests on the credibility of that foundational premise. 300 Sayyad-4 missiles just challenged that premise in the most direct way available operational combat results. 12 destroyed F-35s is not a data point that can be analytically dismissed or narratively managed away from the serious defense establishments of the world that are processing it right now. In Tokyo, in Seoul, in Warsaw, in Canberra, in every capital where government has organized its defense planning around F-35 capability guarantees, serious military professionals are sitting with last night's engagement results and asking uncomfortable questions about what exactly they paid for and what exactly it will do for them when it matters most. From where I stand, the strategic significance of last night's demonstration is not primarily about the Middle East. It is about what Iran has proven regarding the pathway to challenging American air power dominance and who is going to follow that pathway with the industrial and technical capacity to implement it at far greater scale. Russia has been watching this engagement with the closest professional attention of any external military establishment. Moscow's own surface-to-air missile programs, the S-400, the S-500, the developmental systems that follow them are more capable than the Sayyad-4 inches, virtually every measurable parameter. The operational lessons from Iranian Sayyad-4 employment against F-35 operations will be incorporated into Russian air defense doctrine for potential conflict in European theaters with a speed and thoroughness that NATO air power planners need to be honestly accounting for right now. China's defense analytical establishment is equally attentive and equally capable of acting on what it is learning. Beijing's investment in surface-to-air missile systems, in radar technology, in electronic warfare capability, specifically oriented against stealth aircraft, has been sustained and substantial across the past decade. The Iranian proof of concept against operational F-35 combat missions validates the strategic logic of that entire investment program. In any scenario involving Chinese air defense systems defending against American or allied F-35 operations over Taiwan, over the South China Sea, in any of the contingencies that American Indo-Pacific strategy is designed to manage, Chinese air defense commanders now have real operational data on F-35, vulnerability to active seeker surface-to-air missiles that their planning will incorporate. The broader lesson being absorbed in defense ministries from Pyongyang to Caracas to every capital where government is trying to understand how to defend its sovereignty against potential American military pressure is the same lesson that Iran has been demonstrating across multiple domains over the past decade. The pathway to challenging American military dominance does not run through building equivalent platforms. It runs through identifying the specific dependencies and specific vulnerabilities of those platforms and investing in the capability to exploit those vulnerabilities at operational scale. GPS dependency was the first vulnerability Iran demonstrated at scale through electronic warfare operations that compromised F-35 navigation and weapon delivery. Low observable detection through multi-frequency radar and passive sensing was the second. Active seeker terminal guidance capable of defeating stealth advantages at operational engagement ranges is the third, demonstrated definitively last night. Each demonstration is a chapter in a strategic manual that adversaries around the world are reading with professional attention. The Gulf Cooperation Council states are processing last night's results with an anxiety that their public statements will not reflect, but that their private security reassessments most certainly will. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar have made enormous investments in American military equipment. F-35s on order, Patriot batteries installed, THAAD systems contracted predicated on the assumption that American technological superiority would be decisive in any regional conflict. The Israeli experience last night with American-supplied F-35s against Iranian-supplied Sayyad-4 systems is not an abstraction for Gulf defense planners. It is a direct data point about the capability of systems they own against the capability of systems their primary regional adversary has demonstrated. The multipolar transition in global military affairs that I have been describing for years is not arriving gradually or in a form that existing institutions can manage through incremental adaptation. It is arriving in the wreckage of 12 F-35s distributed across the airspace above the Middle East, in the demonstrated operational fact that a sanctioned, isolated regional power has developed and deployed surface-to-air missile capability sufficient to destroy the most advanced combat aircraft the United States has ever exported in operational combat conditions. What comes after this demonstration depends on decisions being made right now in institutions that have not yet fully processed what the demonstration means. The American defense establishment can respond with honest acknowledgement of the capability gap, emergency acceleration of the technologies that can close it, and a fundamental reassessment of the doctrinal assumptions that led to this outcome. Or it can manage the narrative, protect the procurement program, and allow the gap to persist while adversaries continue to exploit it. I know which response the institution's incentive structure makes more likely. I have watched this institution operate under pressure for decades. But I also know that operational reality eventually imposes itself regardless of institutional preference. 12 destroyed F-35s are a reality that no amount of narrative management permanently suppresses. The age of assumed F-35 survivability in contested airspace has ended. Iran ended it, and the world that comes after it is one in which American military power remains formidable but no longer commands the unquestioned operational credibility that has underwritten American strategic influence for 30 years. 12 F-35s are gone. The Israeli Air Force is operating in a permanently changed threat environment that its doctrine was not designed for, and its institutional culture has not yet fully adapted to. Washington is silent in the way that institutions are silent, when they know the truth is more damaging than the silence. And Iran has written another chapter in a strategic manual that I have been watching it develop for years, patient, disciplined, empirically validated, and designed for an adversary that consistently underestimates it until the evidence becomes undeniable. I've spent my career trying to tell the American military establishment truths it did not want to hear. I told them that the procurement culture that prioritized contractor relationships over operational honesty was building vulnerabilities into the force. I told them that adversaries were studying American operational patterns with a patience and focus that American threat assessment was not adequately accounting for. I told them that the assumption of technological superiority as a permanent condition rather than a continuously contested one was dangerous. 12 F-35s answered those arguments more definitively than anything I could say. The question now is whether the institutions responsible for American and allied security will respond with the honesty and the urgency that last night's operational results demand, or whether they will do what institutions under pressure most naturally do and manage the crisis rather than honestly confront what caused it. My assessment, based on everything I know about how these institutions operate, they will manage it first. But operational reality has a way of imposing itself. It imposed itself last night over the Middle East. It will impose itself again. And every time it does, the argument for honest strategic reassessment becomes harder to defer. What is your assessment of what Washington should do and what it will actually do in the aftermath of 12 destroyed F-35s? And what does this mean for every other nation that has organized its air defense against the F-35 threat? Drop your analysis in the comments. This conversation matters beyond this channel and beyond this conflict. If this analysis gave you the unfiltered strategic reality that institutional silence is designed to prevent, share it, hit like, and subscribe. Stay sharp, stay informed, and never stop questioning what the institutions responsible for your security are telling you. We will see you in the next one.